Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Nidhi Srinivas, a professor of management at the New School. His research uses critical theory to examine a range of topics, including management history, international development, mutual aid, ecological politics, and civic design. His latest book is Against NGOs, a critical perspective on civil society, management, and development, published earlier this year by Cambridge University Press. I welcome Nidhi Srinivas to Savage Minds. I actually contacted you because when I read parts of your book, Against NGOs, a critical perspective on civil society, management, and development, I thought back to Graham Hancock's The Lords of Poverty, a book which I read after much work in Haiti, where when I left the University of Montreal, went to Haiti, went there to dig latrines, just do agricultural and organic farming projects there. I read the book after I returned to New York from Haiti, and I was shocked. I thought, oh my God, this guy's writing about something that I just saw, but he wrote about this decades ago, and the problem's still ongoing. We are seeing the exact same problems within NGOs that I just witnessed in half an island, the size of the state of Maryland. Haiti has over 10,000 NGOs. I went there to volunteer and had people throwing contracts at me, even from the UN, by the way, NGO contracts, trying to, even by my silence, because many people were nervous when they realized I was writing a series of articles that later became a book. In fact, I didn't know about Graham Hancock's book, and I ended up writing a parallel life experience amidst these organizations. And what I realized very quickly is that as an anthropologist working in the field, especially in developing countries, you come across frequently the persistent presence of NGOs from Bolivia to Nicaragua, Morocco, India, Indonesia. I saw them everywhere. But the one thing that struck me about Haiti, aside from the Clinton theft of $10 billion, was just the marked nature of how all of the people populating these NGOs, and especially the UN, were an extension of colonialism, what my friend Ken would call white flannel, or what some people call the white saviors, who are often Oxbridge and Ivy League variety graduates, right? And I found these people everywhere. And I'm not saying these were nasty people. They were highly intelligent, highly capable, even and quite often as critical of the very institutions that I was critiquing as myself. And yet, what I saw was what my friend Govinda called rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. No, it's true. And he worked for an NGO there, and he was very professional. We were in a cluster group on child trafficking, okay? And what I noticed with all these P2s, P3s in the country is they came in on very short contracts, often contracts that didn't extend beyond 3 months. So they would go, someone else would come in, another Oxbridge graduate in their 20s, and they'd roll their sleeves up, excited to get child traffickers and to protect children. And they were redoing what had just been done. And I saw this, and I saw this, and I saw this in all the months I was there. So I begin with this because I greatly appreciated how you began your book, your preface, where you're on a 6-hour train journey within Greece, and you come across Kadir, another South Asian man, with whom you shared the journey in part and a discussion. And you noted in your preface how class is what, in many respects, distinguishes our lives, those of us writing about this phenomenon, and those on the other side. I'm going to quote you here. You wrote, Kadir had traveled to Greece at great risk to simply find a life. Later in recollection, what struck me of my conversation with him was whether our stark differences could be overcome. This expectation of changing the terms of a life, its opportunities, was also the historical project of international development. Often, its aim of reach was civil society, and in fact, it was a local nonprofit that sponsored Kadir's refugee application, as he informed me. Repeatedly, he asked me, "What is management? Can I learn it?" It was hard to tell him. What was its special quality that had enabled opportunities and jobs he could not himself acquire? A language? No, that was just English. A unique capacity? An insight? Well, then, why was it so hard for everyone to have it? I remain unsure. What could be a management that mattered in terms of him? End quote. So I thought about this because I had similar Kadirs in my life. And I think back to when I was in Haiti at this FAO meeting with the Minister of Agriculture in Haiti, who was pushing, I'm not making this up, I wish I were, he was pushing Monsanto seeds that they had gifted, for, in air quotes, to these farmers. And all the Haitian farmers that I had met were well under the age of 25. And at this meeting, they stood along the walls. I actually had a seat at the table. They didn't even know why I was there at one point because I was an interloper. I was doing work with UNICEF and against UNICEF, documenting the way that child trafficking was allowed to take place under the noses of these organizations. And then I showed up there because my day off was basically doing WASH. And I was in a WASH cluster and helping with this project outside of Port-au-Prince that was a seed propagation project. So these farmers, some of them I knew from the seed propagation project, and Monsanto was giving them non-propagating seeds. But they were young, and just like in South Asia, it's the same thing in Haiti, you don't disagree with your elders. And I could see their eyes upset, but they couldn't speak. So I did. And I raised my hand and I told the Minister of Agriculture, I said, "You're pushing Monsanto here? I can't even believe what I'm hearing. The Monsanto is the Antichrist to these farmers." And he said, "But no, this is a gift," and blah, blah, blah. And the farmers were very happy. Later, they thanked me for speaking up. But the problem is that, of course, I was powerless to change what were basically backdoor NGO deals. How many solar ovens were never used in Haiti? I interviewed people there who spoke about the solar oven graveyards. All these NGOs with their gimmicks to get 5, 6, 7-figure contracts out of the deal. And they go home after they've sold their wares. You begin your book with this wonderful preface. I really appreciated it. And you noted how the institutions, even from where you come, are in a way part of the dynamic of what you and I and many others have witnessed. And you wrote, "While writing this book, I have worked at the New School, a university of myth, exigency, and contingency. These three realms have had an impact on this book: the historically leftist aspirations of faculty, top-down administrative directives that can offer instruction in misguided managerialism, and especially a space of possibility that emerges from the muddy hopes and jagged aspirations of students and faculty." I'd like to start, if we could, with a critique of the kinds of institutions that you and I prevail from, academia, that ostensibly ought to be critiquing these very colonial structures that end up feeding them their P3s, P4s, and P5s, their future managerial levels, right? And could you speak about the reproducibility of academia and maintaining the savior complex within the quote-unquote developing or quote-unquote third world?
Julian, it's a pleasure to be on Savage Minds, and I want to thank you profusely, not just for the opportunity to join you, but also for the way you've begun. I think you've summarized my book far better than I could. For the readers, for the listeners, I should say, I didn't know this till I joined, but it would seem Julian and I both have a connection with the New School, the institution where I work. It's a small private university based in New York City, and was founded by three faculty who left Columbia University in the early part of the 20th century, largely because Columbia University at that time imposed a loyalty oath, which meant that faculty in Columbia had to confirm that they would defend the United States in World War I. And these three faculty members were, I think, reasonably patriotic, but they felt it was inappropriate to ask faculty to take such a stand, and that and some other issues to do with how the university functioned, the lack of faculty governance, made them leave Columbia University and create a new institution. Now, generally, most people who do not know the new school typically ask, what the hell do you mean by calling yourself a new school? And even now, if you go on Google and type in new school, depending where you are in the world, you'll generally get an answer that is not the university where I work. On the other hand, the reason it was called the new school is because Columbia University was the old school, and these three faculty members were very canny. They quickly had worked out. Columbia University was and is island of privilege within a city which is one of the most unequal in the world and is also probably the wealthiest in the world. And they said, we want to try to create something different. Now, I'm not going to spend my time here trying to explain what the new school is, but I'm just giving this as a background because it helps me answer the very, very good question Julian's posed. Now, Julian mentioned at one point a friend of ours, Govinda, who described what NGOs do as being rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Now, I like this analogy very much. So listeners, please think for a moment. Imagine you were on the Titanic. Imagine for a moment that the Titanic is listing. Okay, you want to go up to the captain and say, "Look, are we going to sink?" Or you wish to go to your fellow passengers and say, look, am I safe in third class? Maybe, I should pay some more and upgrade myself. Maybe they won't save the third class people in case the ship sinks. But imagine instead, the stewards come up to you and say, you know what? We need you to rearrange the deck chairs. And when you rearrange the deck chairs, you're going to be doing something really valuable. And when you finish, we'll give you a really nice prize. It might just distract you from the task at hand. It might even, if I may put it this way, make you forget that the ship is sinking. So the analogy that Julian's friend offered is actually a very, very good one because it works both for NGOs and, if I may say so, it works for academia. Let me briefly explain the first, and then I'll explain the second, which is really the answer to Julian's question. NGOs are a salve. They're not bad, they're not good, they're a salve. They help work on a wound. But the question is the wound one that can actually be healed through what NGOs do? Take Haiti. Haiti is one of the most poorest countries. It is the poorest country actually in the Northern Hemisphere. It used to be the wealthiest. Anyone who knows the history of Haiti will know at one point it was making a huge amount of money through sugar plantations that exported sugar, which was at that time a very valuable product. Through a very long history, which included the French government imposing very harsh terms, which Haiti is still paying, and the United States replacing the French government as a colonial power, interfering in Haiti, and also, imposing its own demands. Because of all of this, Haiti is today, in many ways, a failed state. And I'm not convinced that I should be blaming the Haitians for that. And in such a context, what an NGO does is it becomes a quasi power. But it's a quasi power with no responsibility. It's not elected by the people. It does not have to respond to the people. It responds to its funders. And guess who are the majority of the funders of NGOs in Haiti? Yes, it's the United States. And for the record, the United States, which has a very long and rather rich reputation of interfering in the rest of the world with very little knowledge of the rest of the world, and generally with very little responsibility for the rest of the world, you just need to look at Afghanistan in the last 5 years. And if you wish, you can go all the way back to Vietnam as well. At what I should be calling as the American War, as the Vietnamese do. But the United States does not actually coordinate these NGOs. It's not that they all go into Haiti with one goal. Let's say they all wish to go in and say, we wish Haiti to become an American colony, right and proper. We're going to build roads, we're going to put up McDonald's everywhere, and we're going to make you all Christians and have you all join, I don't know, the local school assembly, and we'll do all of this and you'll become good Americans. Let's say they were to do that. That may not actually be such a terrible thing. At least, it might reduce poverty. The problem is the United States funds a variety of NGOs that spend most of their time doing small projects, fighting with each other, conspiring against each other, battling, and in general, ignoring the Haitians and the existing Haitian state, thus perpetuating Haiti remaining a colony, except it's now not a colony to the United States. It's a colony to this disorganized bunch of NGOs. Now, when I say this, there are a lot of NGOs that do good in the world, including in Haiti. But how do I put this? That's hardly the point, right? I mean, we're not arguing that all NGOs are bad. We're trying to understand how NGOs are a symptom of an underlying problem. Now, this is to do with Haitian NGOs. Now, what does this have to do with academia? Well, as Julian just mentioned, if you work in the UN, if you wish to join an NGO, if you wish to join a nonprofit organization, you typically need a master's degree and in many cases a PhD. These are all arranged by disciplines. So to give you an example, I did my education in a business school, so I have a PhD in management. A PhD in management moves you in certain directions, a PhD in economics moves you in other directions, and so forth. So what you have then is a situation where in many ways universities today retain an expectation that the disciplinary training that they'll offer will somehow help us keep the world going in the way it is. If you wish, if I could stretch the analogy a little bit further, it's not that they're rearranging the deck chairs. They're trying to tell you what kinds of deck chairs there are, how heavy they'll be, how many deck chairs can fit on the deck. But the one thing they're not telling you is, you know what? None of this is going to help you because the ship is sinking. And now, if I may ask you, dear listener, to consider this analogy further, imagine you're now going to do a master's in sociology, a master's in economics, or even an MBA. What is the point of doing it at a moment when we're on the verge of a global recession, on the verge of another global war, and just like the last two ones, a war that really should be avoided, um, and we're on the verge of severe levels of inequality and strife, which are getting worse because, how do I put this politely? They're getting worse due to unhinged leadership in some of the more powerful countries of the world. So I would argue then that the analogy is simple. The education we receive is an education that's not really allowing us to appreciate what's happening around us. It's actually dulling us from understanding it. It's dulling us from seeing things for what they are. My book is deeply influenced by the work of Antonio Gramsci, and I briefly allude to him in the first chapter of my book, Introduction. In the Quaderni del Carcere, the prison diaries, Gramsci actually states very clearly that the world we're in right now cannot change unless we make an effort to see it differently. And to see it differently is a political task. I would argue that the problem today is that a lot of education and the spheres of civil society where NGOs are based are not actually eager to offer that kind of a critique. They're eager instead to allow us to become naturalized to the system as it is, without acknowledging or even recognizing its limitations.
This is a phenomenon to me because when you see management, as I'm sure you know, most people in management
Mhm,
are not the sorts who read Antonio Gramsci. Many
mhm,
people in the United States who study management are believers in management and the management can save
mhm,
us culture. Yet, you and I share political affiliations. It's very clear from what you've just said. And you have people like Adolf Reed, who in fact have come
mhm,
very hard down on the managerial elite, who have rendered, in fact, this kind of network of making academia or making NGOs a new culture in itself. So, what is the ethos here of what NGOs are supposed to be doing in the post World War II era? Because, as I mentioned earlier on, I mean, I do view much more critically, in fact, than you do, from what I've read in your book, NGOs' presence, because I do regard them as this kind of prolongation of colonialism, or if you wish, the last vestiges of colonialism.
mhm,
I appreciate, though, that you ask what they can do. Are they necessarily an evil force? I think a lot of people
mhm,
might say yes, because what we're seeing is that they are rearranging the deck chairs. And there's never anything, that's something I saw in Haiti. Nothing's ever really solved. It's left always in a similar but different way, but we can still stay in the country and collect the 10 billion, right? And as you mentioned,
mhm,
in the 1950s, Haiti was a very wealthy country. It made a load of money even from just fruit itself. But then if we go and look
mhm,
what the United States and Great Britain did, well, first Great Britain, the US, with United Fruit, and we see the devastation that it affected, not just in Haiti, but in Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, and what is today
mhm,
Dole or Chiquita. And these companies
mhm, mhm,
have become a new superpower in and of themselves. So they were able to squash the local production or to keep people from being able to live off what was their
Hmm.
production. I begin to see
Hmm.
colonialism everywhere, unfortunately, and I wish I didn't. What I experienced in Haiti, even within the UN, I mean, that was just as troubling, that there was this idea that we were going to come in and help out with these kinds of massive, dire problems. But at the end of the day, it was about exercising the management over in the same way that we could go back 100 years and see what was happening with the East India Company in what is today Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Well, let's just go into your book because in your second chapter, you begin by going over some of Arundhati Roy's work, which you
Hmm.
admire. And you write, I wish to consider Roy's essays less for its merits, but as a symptom of current tendency into intellectual politics. Though the essay discusses many aspects representative of capitalism, it neglects the possibility that notions of development, management, and civil society are entwined in this contemporary moment. Yet the essay's concern with corporate power gestures to market friendly alliances that have transformed the project of development. Though unacknowledged management ideas influence such corporate power. For one thing, the corporations she describes obviously employ managers. It is reasonable to expect a majority of them trained at business schools. It is these managers who are ultimately responsible for seizing public land for mining, colluding with state authorities in rights violations, and pursuing corporate branding through alliances with NGOs. So and before that you actually speak positively about much of Arundhati Roy's work and critiques of what would again be late stage capitalism taking place in developing countries. However, there's a problem here. On the one hand, we have late stage capitalism and the fact that people all over the world, including the developing world, are creating situations that are basically affecting havoc because goods are not shared. The means of production are not shared. Look what happens in Chennai with Coca-Cola taking all the water. So you have some kind of inequality at the base, and then NGOs can pop in, and they do. They come into India. This is one thing that's very much disturbed me. I had an interview at Ashoka University years ago. And the person who interviewed me was all schooled in gender ideology and pronouns. And I'm thinking, what the heck? Like, this
Hmm.
is a private university, and I get that you're representing the 1% of
Hmm.
the creme de la creme of India, but this is
Hmm.
not where maybe humanity should be today, thinking about preferred pronouns. But that's where you see what I'm saying? And this has permeated the NGO culture. One of the projects I've
Yeah,
worked
yeah.
on has been in gender ideology. And I've interviewed many people in India who've discussed the fact that gender ideology has come in through the NGOs and has given access to a kind of neoliberal language of Western discourse that again is a ticket to ka-ching ka-ching. Do you want to study? Okay,
Hmm.
then reproduce the language of gender ideology and you can
Hmm.
go and
Hmm.
study there, right? So
Hmm.
I begin to wonder to what degree a lot of what NGOs are doing is ideological emplacement and buttressing on the one hand, and on
Hmm.
the other, there's no discussion of the harms of capitalism throughout. Would these NGOs
Hmm.
even be necessary without a kind of dismantling of the very capitalistic fortresses that have
Hmm.
created this inequality in the first place?
Well, I mean, look, let's begin with Arundhati Roy. I'm very glad you mentioned her. I greatly admire Arundhati Roy. In fact, I think I would say I admire her pretty much unconditionally. I mean, I can argue about this and that, but she's an extraordinary individual. She's one of the great public intellectuals that India has produced. In fact, I would argue that the world has produced. I greatly admire her. The reason I gave the impression in that first chapter that I was, despite my admiration for her, not fully on board with what she was saying, is actually due to two different essays. In one of them, which she wrote right after the Iraq War, she talks about how civil society is actually trying to ensure the Iraq War doesn't happen. And this is long back, and we were talking of maybe 2002, 2004. And in the second essay, which is the one that I quote in that is mentioned in the passage you quoted, she's now talking about how NGOs are colluding with corporate capital in India and whitewashing what corporations are doing. So it's as if civil society is good and NGOs are bad. And that's the one part which I take exception to. And here again, I would suspect if I was speaking to Arundhati right now, she'd actually tell me, no, no, I don't see it that way at all. I think you misunderstood me, Nidhi, and that's fine. But basically, I would argue that the way NGOs are understood is generally from the perspective of capitalism. And the passage that Arundhati is talking about is a passage where we see the danger of late stage capitalism. Late stage capitalism is a period when the crises of capitalism can no longer be reduced or overcome. You can't just keep rearranging the deck chairs, the water is coming in. But when you're rearranging the deck chairs historically, the expectation was always, you know what? That's politics. It's great. This is what democracy is. You get to decide what color the deck chairs will be, how many deck chairs should be there. You know, if you wish, you can even discuss whether the deck chairs are sufficient for this ship. Is the ship doing well? Because we're not going to stop you if you say the ship is sinking. Communism will tell you that you can't say that, but we in capitalism believe in freedom of speech. Do you believe the ship is sinking? How many of you believe the ship is sinking? See, not everyone does, but you got the chance to speak. So that's essentially the way historically liberal capitalism functioned. The notion was that there was a democracy, and the democracy was expressed in civil society. What Arundhati does very well in that essay is remind us that that formulation doesn't work anymore. At least it doesn't in India. I fear that the way she poses her critique of NGOs gives the impression that civil society is somehow free of the problems that NGOs can have. And I also fear that the way she poses it, we don't really recognize that NGOs are actually universal phenomena that's shaped by what capitalism demands of us. So, it's sort of like the only way to describe it is if you see the deck chairs on the Titanic and you keep rearranging them, sometimes that looks like politics, it looks like democracy, and that can seem a good thing. And then you can argue, well, you know what? That's what's not happening because NGOs are coming into the picture. They're taking over the rearranging of the deck chairs, if you will. Well, the problem with that kind of an analogy, and I'm not going to argue that that's what Roy is doing, but I do feel some of the people who read her essays may think it that way. The problem with that analogy is that in late capitalism, politics generally looks like NGOs. Almost globally today, what we're looking at is a sort of a decline in political behavior, especially in political behavior that goes through representational democracy. And we see a lot of reliance on NGOs to both make us ourselves feel better, to make ourselves feel we're doing something, and to feel reassured that in some ways the world around us is improving. On the other hand, if you were to flip that and look at some real successes where either development has genuinely happened or political empowerment has genuinely happened, we find that they're intensely political. They usually involve grassroots groups, they involve a lot of work, a lot of conflict, honest talk. And they don't involve an emphasis on funding, on corporate planning, and so forth, which is what NGOs are generally seen as doing. So it's that notion of politics that we're losing. And that notion of politics is very, very hard to recover. It's not one that just emerges through a crisis like the Iraq War. It's one that governments globally are actually very hostile to, and they're doing their best to reduce it. So, if you look, for instance, in India, the object of Roy's critique, she's actually saying how the Indian state is working very closely with corporations and working very closely with them to basically ensure that a system of politics, genuine politics, if you wish, is replaced with a performativity that NGOs can offer and a language that NGOs can offer that makes you feel that something has actually been accomplished.
What is the purpose of NGOs today? Many people, you'll hear people say, my daughter works at X NGO or the UN. We haven't really caught up from the populace generales, as it were, of people still revering these very institutions that, in my mind, are they only bringing the Kadirs over to Greece and furnishing workers for cheap
Mhm,
architectural installations or expensive architectural installations that they can
mhm,
underpay? There are a lot of ethical questions in how today NGOs are undertaken, where we've got the CEOs of these NGOs or leaders making six-figure salaries, and
mhm,
they rely largely on underpaid new graduates who quickly shift out. It was something I
mhm,
noticed also in Haiti, how many people stopped at P3 within the UN and they got out. They were like, this isn't for me. And then there, of course, there's the Peter principle that seems to be quite active in these NGOs. It's all very open-ended, full sail display of where capitalism fails, plus the Peter
mhm,
principle, plus the financialization and debt crisis on the world stage being acted
mhm.
out. And the people suffering this, of course, are the poor. So, what is the role today of NGOs, Nidhi? At the end of the day, they seem to just be helping the super elite and their children who graduate from Oxbridge and go and fill a role within the
Mhm,
UN for a few years until they go off and form
mhm,
their charity.
mhm, mhm. Well, I mean, historically, they're very crudely put, there were two paths historically that the object of our discussion, the NGOs, could have taken. One path would have been a political path. And if they'd taken that path, let's say, we would be discussing whether it is appropriate that migrants are not allowed into the European Union. We would be discussing, is it really appropriate that so many countries in Europe today essentially exploit undocumented migrant labor, but don't acknowledge it while also simultaneously demonizing migrants? That's what we would do if we were to take that path. A second path is one where instead of challenging the system of power, instead of actually creating an object of critique, you accommodate to the system of power and you find ways to earn a living through it. And in that second path, you welcome some undocumented migrants because you know your NGO gets EU funding, and that EU funding requires some undocumented migrants. 8 or 10 of them turn up in the morning, and I'm giving you here an actual story that a friend of mine recounted in the city of Arezzo in Italy. Early morning, about 10 migrants turn up, and you pick one or two of them because they're the suitable ones, and the rest of them are sent away. They're not suitable for the EU funding you need. And that EU funding you won't get unless you have some undocumented migrants. So the undocumented migrants are a means to the end of maintaining your NGO. Now, these are two different paths, Julian. Now, the first of these paths is a political path, and that is actually historically what we expected of civil society. So, if we look at, let's say, the notion of civil society in Alexis de Tocqueville and Antonio Gramsci's work, it's very intimately connected to the system of power and asking to what extent it supports the system of power and to what extent it actually does not. So, in that sense, civil society becomes a realm for critique. The second of these, where we are looking at NGOs, with the word NGOs, is actually very young. It's from maybe 1948. The word NGO itself was coined by the Department of Public Information after it became part of the articles in the UN system. And the UN system's articles defined an NGO as a non-governmental organization given an observer status within the United Nations. The United Nations represent nation states. So there are some organizations that are not nation states but do represent constituencies. And the United Nations decided we have to allow them in, but we can't let them make decisions. So they can be allowed in as observers. But what do we name them? What do we call them? And they decided we'll call them non-governmental organizations. So the earliest definition of an NGO had nothing whatsoever to do with international development. It didn't really have anything to do with social welfare, social services, and delivery of services. It had to do with representation of constituencies that overlapped over nation states. Now, of course, that's not the way we look at NGOs today, but as you can see, the latter is a designation that works with an existing system of power. Now, I just want to add there are some worthwhile NGOs out there For instance, there's one I know that rescues undocumented migrants who are about to drown in the Mediterranean, and they routinely bring them to 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 the shores that allow them to host them. Typically, these are shores in Italy. Malta, to its eternal shame, never allows any of them to dock in its docks. But Italy does, though increasingly Italy does not allow the ships to dock at the nearest port, but insists they go further away. But all of these efforts are by organizations. Now, these are organizations that are deeply critical of what the EU stands for. They're deeply critical of the migrant policy of the EU, and they're well aware that the EU's foreign policy, which is basically that of being a satellite of the United States, ensures it'll continue to get undocumented migrants. Most of these are the casualties of US imperialism. And they're spilling over into Europe's shores largely because Europe doesn't have the backbone to actually tell the United States to stop doing what it's doing in Syria, historically, Afghanistan, and so forth. Now, having said this, the tussle here is one that is at one level within organizations that call themselves NGOs themselves. They have to ask themselves, how do we politicize the work we're doing? And that's something that they find very hard to do. Often they think of grant raising, they think of ways they can please different people. They rarely sit there and say, how can we piss off people to the point where our constituents get so angry and mobilized that something happens? They rarely think that way, and maybe you can't really blame them. I mean, they're not trying to be Che Guevara. On the other hand, you can also argue that the challenge really here is with every one of us, wherever we are in the world, because we have to increasingly be against NGOs. We can't turn to NGOs and say, you'll save us. There's no one who's going to save us except ourselves. Right? I mean, even Che, when he went into Bolivia, he didn't go into Bolivia saying, I'm Che, I'm the superhero from Marvel Comics, and I'm going to save you. He went in to say, look, I'm here to help you. You wish to fight. Now, I apologize that I mentioned Bolivia because it isn't a very good example given what happened to Che there. But certainly, if you look at the Cuban Revolution, what Che, what Fidel, and the others did was not a situation where they just went in and had a civil war and won Cuba for themselves. They genuinely led a revolution. And it was a revolution that even today is an extraordinary effort of most Cuban people.
Well, actually, Bolivia is a very good example in many respects when we're discussing NGOs, because as you might know, in the early 1970s, the Peace Corps was kicked out of Bolivia when it was discovered that they had been sterilizing the indigenous population. And part of this sterilization project that came from higher than their pay grades, let's put it that way. And there
Mhm,
was, in fact, a bloodbath that ensued. And there's a famous film by Jorge Sergines called Yawar Malku in Quechua, for Blood of the Condor in English. And this film
mhm,
actually tells the story of the people taking revenge against these American Peace Corps workers. And it was only, I believe, maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that the Peace Corps was allowed to return to Bolivia. But this was one of the many examples of how neocolonialism is affected through the NGO circuit. We let
mhm,
you in, you sterilize our people, we call that reproductive health care, end of story.
mhm,
But of
mhm,
course, there are people having, especially with social media and the rise of the mobile phone that can film, people are now telling their own stories. One thing I liked about the introduction in your book is where you bring in the importance of critical theory. Could you discuss
mhm,
that a bit? Because I had a debate this summer with someone who was trying to diss the importance of the Frankfurt School, and going back to
mhm,
the old debates of some people who criticize Adorno, Horkheimer, Benjamin, because they're somehow detracting from the workers' revolution, when in fact
mhm.
their work is the contemporary site of all forms of Marxist cultural revolution.
Mhm, mhm. Well, I mean, thank you, Julian. I very much appreciate the reference to Blood of the Condor. I don't know this movie at all, and I don't know this episode, and I'm very eager to know more about it. Let me see. Let me respond to what you asked about the Frankfurt School, and let me then see if I can return out to Bolivia and to that moment in '69. The Frankfurt School, for the listeners who don't know it, is historically understood to be a group of thinkers who originated in the Institute of Social Research in Frankfurt. During World War II, they fled Frankfurt and restarted in Morningside Heights in New York City, in essentially in Harlem in New York City. And then after the war ended, some of them dispersed to California, and some of them left the Frankfurt School entirely, and then the remainder returned to the Institute of Social Research in Frankfurt, where they remained and moved ahead. Essentially, there are three generations of the Frankfurt School most people think of. There is the early period, which is the period that I personally find quite compelling, and it's associated with the early lectures of Max Horkheimer. These are lectures where Horkheimer tries to explain how ideas we take for granted originated historically through certain forms of conflict. So, for instance, he looks at Machiavelli's Prince and tries to understand how Machiavelli's notion of the sovereign emerged during the period of Italian history at that time. The second period, which is the period most people think of when they think of the Frankfurt School, is associated with Horkheimer and Adorno's work, which they published just as the war started. And in their work, they gave a very gloomy vision, a pessimistic vision, where rationality had overcome any possibility of credible politics. So, to put it very bluntly, there was really no way any of us anywhere in the world could actually challenge capitalism, because even our effort to challenge it would itself be capitalistic. To put it simply, they really felt capitalism had won. When you read Minima Moralia, Adorno's brilliant, deeply humorous, mordant aphorisms, one of the aspects that really comes clear is how deeply embedded capitalism is within our psyche and within our soul. The third generation of the Frankfurt School is, in my view, that of Jürgen Habermas. And I don't wish to spend much time on Habermas, but one criticism that is made of Habermas is that he sought to somehow snatch optimism from the jaws of pessimism. That is to
Mm-hmm.
say, he took the notion of instrumental rationality that was pessimistic to Horkheimer and Adorno, and he somehow tried to rehabilitate it through what he felt would be a set of rules, which would allow free speech and clear speech to take place. And through such clear speech, you would somehow rehabilitate capitalism, but at the same time discipline it. So capitalism would no longer be merely exploitative. It would also, in some ways, allow you to be liberated, provided you did it through these sets of speech acts. Now, there's a good reason why people on the left may see all of this as deeply, deeply unsatisfying. For one thing, as you can see, if you look at this as a common thread, capitalism has won. Why would you concede a victory when you haven't fought the war yet? That's certainly a position to take. Second, let's say you happen to be someone who believes firmly in the stages of history that some associate with Karl Marx, and which is certainly a Marxist position. So, for instance, feudalism is succeeded by capitalism. Capitalism will be succeeded by communism, right? There will be a dictatorship of the workers, if you will. If you believe that, then of course you're not going to agree with Horkheimer and Adorno at all, or with Habermas. But Horkheimer and Adorno's basic point is that your commitment to a sort of a scientific belief in these laws of history is itself a rational act and is itself, therefore, hopeless and doomed. And so I actually feel the greatest value of the Frankfurt School is in the early and in the middle, in that order. It's the early Horkheimer that alerts us to how capitalism itself shapes ideas. And it is the middle Horkheimer, and especially Adorno in Minima Moralia, who reminds us that if we want to actually challenge how capitalism functions, we'll have to not just challenge the world around us, we'll have to challenge our own soul. Now, the reason critical theory plays a big role in my book is precisely in these two areas: how ideas are shaped by history, and how to tackle the stages of capitalism, we have to interrogate how these ideas work within our soul. I don't spend too much time on the latter in my book, except in the final chapter, but they're very, very closely linked. So, for instance, if you look at NGOs emerge in a discourse of humanitarianism, a discourse of help that is very, very closely linked to liberal capitalism. Imagine you worked in China in the 50s or the 60s. Why on earth would you need NGOs? It would make no sense, right? Imagine you were in a workers' commune on a metaphoric desert island. Would you need NGOs? Of course not. You would have the workers' commune, right? The NGO emerges because somehow we want to square the circle between capitalism's commitment to wealth and the desire for some level of equality. And that's what NGOs are meant to do. So, and it is a squaring of a circle because, of course, capitalism at its extreme is not about equality at all. It is about generating wealth, which means inequality. And inequality leads to more wealth generation. That's what capitalism does. It is the state that moderates capitalism, not NGOs. But if the state then mobilizes NGOs as a salve, it becomes wonderful. We no longer are critical of capitalism. We can instead endorse it because NGOs are there to help make it happen, right? So it's that kind of a move that I'm trying to make in my book. And that's why I find critical theory very valuable. Now, I do want to make one thing very, very clear. What I call critical theory, others may not. And there are, in fact, some who would argue that the Frankfurt School is not in any way representative of critical theory. A lot is at heart, at work here in that phrase. So let me just unpack very clearly where I stand on this. To me, critical theory is a commitment to world systems theory, to Immanuel Wallerstein's ideas on how systems function. It is a world historical view of capitalism, and it is particularly sensitive to what Antonio Gramsci talked about as the creation of consent. And it is the notion of hegemony that Gramsci brings up that I find is particularly important in this regard. So my use of Horkheimer and Adorno is in that sense rather idiosyncratic. I once did a Google search and I found there was almost no discussion of Antonio Gramsci in any of the research of the Frankfurt School. I even wrote to some experts on the Frankfurt School and asked them, and they said they didn't know of any. I would argue that these are sort of rivers that are flowing in the same direction, but they don't meet. And I'm influenced by all of them.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. It's quite interesting because though the person with whom I had this debate this summer was just insistent that the whole mechanism of criticizing the culture industry was itself a derail from workers' issues. And I said
Yes.
no, because we're not in the industrial revolution. In fact, one would argue, as I pointed out to this person as well, I said, your work would be impossible without the Frankfurt School. Most of everything now that we are producing as a society is no longer taking place within the confines of a kind of Taylorist situation where Charlie
Yeah.
Chaplin is moving that cog and getting caught up in the cogware itself. We are now
Yeah. Yeah.
producing knowledge by sitting at our laptops being told to lock down, baby, 5 years ago, and that it's all in our best interest, while then being told to inject ourselves with substances while having access to information on the interweb that tells us that maybe these are not really good things to inject into ourselves. And then we're still told and doubled down, such that all the democratic rights that our forefathers and foremothers fought for are for naught, because all it took was to put the fear of name your God into people about an imminent death, and that's how 9/11 was so successful, right? This is how fear functions. So I would argue that, in fact, the Frankfurt School and critical theory itself is imperative for us to be able to move forth through discussing Marxism within a sociocultural context today.
Mhm. I very much agree with you. And your friend's comment, when I think of it, is actually complicated, if you will, by a reflection on Che Guevara and on his death in Bolivia. Um, Che died in Bolivia, and one interpretation of it was a pointless death. Che hoped by going to Bolivia he would generate a revolution. And it's generally understood that due to a variety of reasons, which are not all his fault, he turned up at the wrong place. And the place he turned up was not the place that was primed for a revolution as such. And he then waged a heroic but ultimately pointless war and died in it, brutally murdered in it, I should add, because he surrendered and then they killed him. Um, However, Che, after he died, became an image. There are many images, including the harrowing image of Che's body being displayed by the CIA funded militia that was then running Bolivia, and was very proud they'd killed him. But by displaying the body, they only made him a saint. And of course, today there are people who paradoxically enough go to that region of Bolivia and they pray. They pray to Che. There are images. We all have know these images of the heroic gorilla, el gorilla heroico, heroico. And this is a famous photograph taken, which has then become a mime or by a meme by itself. Che was culturally transformed, right? So on one hand, through the Frankfurt School, we can argue that it's hopeless. Even an icon of radicalism who hated capitalism, who hated Western imperialism, is today just a commodity, right? We could argue that, and there's, of course, a lot of truth to it, right? On the other hand, is that really all that Che is, right? I mean, when you look at a movie such as the movie on Che that was in two parts that came out, I think maybe a decade back, it's hard to imagine people who watched that film and were not moved by it, who weren't aware watching that film what Batista stood for, and we're not aware that what the United States stood for then is also what it stands for today. There are a variety of ways in which art can actually complicate politics, but that does not mean art isn't political. Art is political. And so, I'm being a little over generous to the Frankfurt School, but the fact that they focused on the cultural industry is not a bad thing. Now, of course, at the end of it all, their view was rather reductive. And you can see this especially in Adorno's views on jazz. Their views ultimately don't really acknowledge that human beings can appropriate cultural materials in all sorts of ways, and that it's good to track those ways that they appropriate them.
So I was thinking more so of the way in which the Frankfurt School foreshadowed what was to come with I'm thinking of
Hmm.
Benjamin's work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which even today in this era of irreproducibility, but everyone is doing it, how many seconds of a song can you have online without breaking the copyright before you get a letter from a lawyer and so forth? These also have become these buoys in the ocean that we can sort of attach meaning to, even though more and more, especially now with the velocity of social media and the many outlets that seem to pop up every 6 months, the new thing. Or the other day, I met a pastry chef here, and when we were exchanging information, I stupidly asked for his Facebook, and he gave me a look like, that's for old folks, you know? So you even begin to understand that even there's a demographic attached to, that's why they're on TikTok. Even Instagram is aging out, right? I begin to see the importance for how we discuss the means of ownership of production, not just commodity fetishism itself, but the means of production themselves are everywhere as we and
Hmm.
others make their living sitting at a laptop producing or reproducing information that then becomes part of a greater social fabric, but even a virtual fabric. Who will see what? We
Hmm.
don't know, because are you paying for advertising with Facebook? Are you getting the
Hmm.
clicks? And everything is about you see this stuff over Gaza, and there's this woman Laura Loomer, who I have called Laura
Hmm.
Lunar, because she says the
Hmm.
most outrageous stuff. I mean, completely unhinged. I've just begun to surmise that she does this to get clicks, that she knows that what she's saying is untrue, that she knows by saying, no, the Gazans look fat, they don't need food, they need a treadmill. Like, you begin to think,
Hmm.
this person's taking the piss, right? But this is a
Yeah.
kind of cultural mechanism that even Horkheimer and Benjamin would never have imagined. I think they would have
Hmm.
envisaged as far as Andy Warhol's soup cans, and that's it.
Yes, I think you're right.
Now we're in this really crazy era of even memes are passe. Everything is about not just the quotability or the hashtagability of something, But it comes down to this kind of Georg Simmel deconstruction of how affable are you? Do you have this kind of persona that will translate online? How do you do
Hmm.
that?
Hmm.
When I was reading your work on the NGOs and the crisis of financial capitalism that you indicate in the book, first in your introduction, then later on, and I think of, but isn't this part of the problem? Like where you asked of the man you met on the train, Kadir, what basically
Hmm.
separated your two journeys, as I've done with the farmers
Hmm.
at the FAO table with me. And I'm thinking,
Hmm.
wait a sec. It's a roll of a dice. I happen to have been born in a country to a father who was super pushy on education. I could have had a father who wasn't. I could have come from another kind
Hmm.
of background. I could be serving donuts in a Tim Horton. Nothing wrong with that, mind you. But the kind of life I would have economically would and intellectually would be very different. And in the same sense,
Hmm.
the questions you ask in your book against NGOs looks at the way in which colonialism in Western Europe and the great colonial powers, France, Britain,
Hmm.
Portugal, lesser extent Italy, Spain, Germany, but they had their roles. The ways in which those colonial enterprises have morphed into the current mandate of let's put a plaster on a sucking chest wound. Because the issues, like
Hmm.
when you said, I'm not so sure that we can blame Haiti for its being one of the
Hmm.
poorest countries in the world, and certainly in the Western
Hmm.
Hemisphere, it's a toss up between it and Bolivia. How do we approach a situation in which Haiti only achieved the wealth it did because it kicked out the French, had to repay the French for its not being slaves to them anymore, bizarrely. But then they
Hmm.
did, Toussaint Louverture had that revolution. People liberated themselves of the French. We know for a fact that Great Britain would be as poor as Uganda today had it not been for all of its colonial enterprising. It
Uh-huh.
stole
Hmm.
wealth from all over the planet. And I'm not talking just
Yeah.
about the debates happening about museums want their pieces back, but everything. Just taking sugar from the Caribbean to South
Hmm.
Asia, that is a massive proportion of today's British wealth. How do the NGOs shore up the damage, or can they? Because this is something that
Hmm.
I don't think can ever be repaired actually. And so when we start talking about reparations, for instance, that's something that's happened in the States regarding the generations post-slavery. I think that even more importantly than that, that maybe reparations are the only way to equal out the balance of all these countries that are floundering. Look what's happening in the Sahel region, where you've got countries
Hmm.
kicking out the French, but the French are now arming other groups to take over.
Hmm. Exactly, exactly. I mean, look, I mean, the notion of reparations, I'm not able to really think it through right now. So I'm not going to be responding to it directly, but only for that reason. I mean, I'm not actually opposed to it. But let me just go back to the comment you made about Laura Loomer. Um, you obviously, when you make that kind of a comment, you're echoing a pessimistic view of the culture industry. It's a very sensible to have that pessimistic view. I mean, let's face it, we've been watching an extermination take place of the people in Palestine for, 40 years and more, made very explicit over the last year and a half. I mean, whatever be the flaws of the current Israeli state, they've been very candid that they really wish to commit genocide. They've never denied it. And it is quite extraordinary that, the rest of the Western world allows them to do it. You would think that they would be a little worried, but no, not at all. The United States and the United Kingdom and the European Union are pretty much behind what Israel is doing right now. A lot of that is certainly because we live in a world where outrage is expressed differently and outrage is dissipated through the kind of media we use. So, yes, I mean, that pessimistic view we can certainly have. On the other hand, I wonder if the way we look at the world right now is going to not stay the same and is going to change very soon. You mentioned the Sahel. I think a decade back, people would have looked at the map and said Mali has borders, and those borders are very clear borders. But they won't be able to say that anymore. I mean, Mali doesn't actually control the northern part of that map. Um, it's fair to say that the groups that are in the Sahel are today reconfiguring in ways that don't anymore accommodate the existing boundaries of the nation states. I think over the next 2 decades, we're going to see a lot of the world look like that. The effect of climate change, the effect of different forms of loyalties and identities that are channeled and brought out both through resentment and through technology, and of course, the effects of inequality and of forms of extremism in the West are all going to lead to a rapid decline in the sort of things we've taken for granted around us. When that happens, I do suspect our reliance on social media will change. I think that we're going to find, to use the metaphor again, and I'm overusing it, Julian, but we're going to find at that moment when the ship is actually sinking, we're no longer all that eager to film us sinking. We're actually eager to find a lifeboat. And I think at that moment, our use of the media will change. So there, I do feel that Horkheimer and Adorno were very much of their moment. I think the world they lived in, they could not have imagined the ecological catastrophe that's about to hit us. They could not have imagined that the Soviet Union would fall apart. They could not have imagined that the United States would behave in the reckless and irresponsible way it's behaving right now. And I don't think they would have imagined that the European Union, including their country, Germany, would become such a slavish satellite of the United States.
In your book, you talk about the early days of where civil society actors
Mhm,
came onto the stage with early humanitarianism. What has changed
mhm.
since that era to today, then? Because it really has become, in the later years, the last 40 years, an industry.
So Julian, in terms of the question you raised, um, I track in my book the initial period when NGOs emerged as really being the early part of colonial, sorry, not the earlier, but the later part of colonial history. So you could say maybe the early part of the 20th century or the later part of the 19th century. And I argue that the notion of an NGO at that time wasn't known. They were certainly not called that. But there were groups, there were civil society groups that were enlisted by the colonial state to work with them. The Salvation Army is an example. The YMCA is another example. Both of them were active in India, for instance, and worked closely with the British state. Now, at the same time, within India, there were groups that were opposed to the British, and they also were civil society groups. They also did provide social services, but they weren't recognized by the state. They didn't work with the state, and the state at times actually repressed them. A similar pattern you see in Africa as well. So you could argue that the notion of an NGO historically emerged from the expectation that civil society would partner with the state, even if the state was a colonial state. That notion has remained with us ever since. So, what has changed is actually the fact that NGOs today are meant to function in a manner that is much more independent of the state financially while remaining respectful of the state's sovereignty. You see this even in legislation. So, in the United States and in many other parts of the world, for you to be registered as a nonprofit or as a non-governmental organization, you have to be very, very clear that you don't take any political stand. If you take a political stand, you risk losing your tax-free status. And of course, if you lose your tax-free status, you won't be able to register as a nonprofit organization or as an NGO. So, for instance, in the United States, there are two laws, parts of legislation, 501(c)(3) and 501(c)(4). If you register under 501(c)(3), you can't say, "Hello, I'm Greenpeace. Please don't vote for the Republicans because they're destroying the planet." You do that, that's a political statement, and you risk losing your tax-free status. On the other hand, if you're listed under 501(c)(4), you can certainly do that. It's a political lobbying legislation, and a lot of the groups that work as lobbyists on Capitol Hill are under 501(c)(4). So this distinction is actually mirrored in most parts of the world, including in the former Soviet Union, in various other places. This distinction makes it also very, very clear that if we look at NGOs today, what is remarkable is they're not expected to actually bite the hand that feeds them, even if that hand gives them less, and even if it doesn't feed them anymore. That's to me one of the important reasons why it is so essential that we start looking at the sphere of civil society as a place for politics, for opposition to the state, and for critique of the state. And we can do it through NGOs, we can do it through other groups, we can call them whatever we wish, but that's really what it's needed. It has to be a sphere of contestation. Otherwise, it just becomes a sphere of efficacy, where we say, you know what, I'll deliver those services better than you will. Well, are those the services that are needed? Will those services be enough? Or, as you put it, Julian, will they be a bandage over a gaping flesh wound? Those are the questions worth asking. And the efficacy, sure, but the efficacy is not the crucial question.
Well, you address this in your third chapter, Modernization Theory, Development Management. So you have a much more positive view as to the potential role NGOs could have. What would that look like?
Well, I mean, in that chapter, I actually track. It's a complicated answer I'm giving. I don't actually have a positive view of what NGOs can offer.
Well, I guess I meant compared to me, because for me,
Yes,
NGOs,
that's
I
true.
would just undo them completely because I think,
Hmm.
let's be honest, they're there to develop jobs for the elite and keep
Hmm.
plasters on things, even to be like blocking the whole stage so that people can't see what's
Hmm.
actually going on. In a way, like when Trump canceled USAID funding, I thought, well, this isn't a bad thing. Maybe people will start to see what's going on here.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, that was my hope.
No, no, I actually was I was not saddened when he canceled USAID funding. And when you mentioned Bolivia, I remember when Evo Morales expelled USAID. And he was very clear that he believed USAID was out to remove his government. And we now know that actually is the case. USAID was actually funding groups claiming to be democratic groups that were opposed to Evo Morales at that time. So Morales was, strictly speaking, quite accurate in saying, you're on the side of the people eager to remove me from power. So why on earth should I let you be there? And I should add that I don't think they were very concerned with the means of removing Morales. So yeah, I mean, look, I let me try to answer this through an example. There was an organization based in Tanzania in the 60s. It was very closely linked to the leader of Tanzania at that time, Julius Nyerere, and it was based around a cooperative that was quite successful. And so when that cooperative was successful, it was a example, if you wish, of credible development that was also politicized because the cooperative was autonomous. It moved away from powerful groups and worked with the powerless and gave them a space. So this cooperative was doing really well. At some point, Nyerere's government, which was a socialist government, decided that this cooperative was doing so well that they would no longer allow it to be autonomous. So they took over the cooperative, made it into a government model, and imposed cooperatives of that kind across Tanzania and controlled them through the government. Now, they did all of this with funding from an NGO, from Oxfam. This is what Oxfam did in the late 60s in Tanzania. The story gets even worse. Once this happened, they also took villagers who were living in different parts of Tanzania, and they moved them out of their villages and made them work in other places. They force migrated them. And then they took the land that they were working on and collectivized it. And unfortunately, because both of the heavy-handed way they did this and also because they weren't very skillful in what they did, it didn't succeed. Collectivizing the land did not lead to better productivity, and the fact that these farmers were now working as forced labor did not improve the situation at all. All of this happened with Oxfam's funding and help. So, how do we then conclude from this? One way to conclude from this is that Oxfam is a terrible organization. Well, everything I've just told you is actually from Oxfam's archives, and it's from accounts by anthropologists who have studied Oxfam. Oxfam does terrible things, but it also is at the moment willing to admit it's done terrible things, including in a recent scandal that happened, in fact, in Haiti. I'm not going to excuse Oxfam, but I think one has to recognize that it's quite complex in this sense. There are NGOs like Oxfam that are very powerful, and which in some ways try to be a little accountable for what they're doing. They may not succeed. So I'm not willing to argue that all NGOs are bad in the same way. And I'm more interested in arguing that whether NGOs are good or bad, they're a symptom of a structural problem. And it's the structural problem that concerns me. And to put it another way, if that structural problem goes away, I'm not very interested in NGOs anymore. That structural problem is simple. It's a problem of poverty. For instance, in Tanzania, the problem was simple. Tanzania was very, very poor. It was a socialist state, but the socialist state was controlled by an elite who were within the political party that ran it and worked with Nyerere. Ultimately, they were not able to translate their control of the country down to the people in it. That's why they took over that cooperative. They could have left it alone, but they wouldn't, right? So those are the complexities that interest me, and those complexities make it harder to actually argue that, NGOs are the problem. It's easier to argue the problem is deeper than what NGOs are. Now, the story I've just told you is at one level an easy enough story. It's a story about a state trying to control civil society. But let me complicate this even further. Just before he was assassinated, Salvador Allende invited Stafford Beer to Santiago de Chile, and Stafford Beer came up with this wonderful technology that would allow Allende to talk to the people and know how the people felt about anything Allende wanted to do. If Allende wanted to, tomorrow take over oil in not oil, I would say, take over, let's say, aluminum in Chile, the people would tell him if they agreed with him or not, right? And so you would have a ready-faced method of reading civil society. So this was what Allende wanted, right? Now, let's say Allende had succeeded. This experiment was about to be inaugurated on September 10th, 1972, or 73, forgive me. It was about to be inaugurated the day before the Moneda Palace was attacked by Pinochet's forces and Allende was killed, right? So it never happened. But let's say it had happened. We would still have to ask ourselves, how would Allende have separated himself from the aspirations of the people to such an extent that the people would themselves remain a democratic force rather than be taken over by the state, right? So the challenge is always the same. Whether we talk of them as NGOs or not, there's a tension between what the civil society and civil society groups are willing to do and the extent the state allows them and doesn't repress them, and the extent the market doesn't impoverish them, or on the other hand, incentivize them to become more unequal and exclusionary.
Yes, I see what you're saying, and I do agree that the problem is structural. I guess the reason
Mhm.
why I would like to disband NGOs is because while they are on stage, they are taking up space for other actors or other beheadings, as it might be.
Yeah, indeed they are. Absolutely they are.
So I worry that they occlude the public view of what's going on. And when I say the public view, of course, what does that even mean in a day and age where you've seen it? We've got an enormous number of people in the West denying the existence of a genocide in Gaza, despite the fact we have evidence on our screens. So what would be even counting as evidence would be shocking to most sentient beings. I really don't know what even to say because, as you point out, the September 11th of the Chileans was something that Americans weren't even aware of during their own September 11th commemorations. And this is
Mhm.
part of the problem is how do we square that circle? I don't know what the expression is quite, but there's something amiss where the very country that has the most power, currently our own, is able to amass such devastation and then rock up and say, hey, we know we destroyed your economy and we invaded you and we're responsible for all these disappearances, but hey, we'll give you a loan, or here's the IMF giving you a loan, and just privatize all of these natural resources and we'll call you democratic. This is sort of the template for what the US has done. Look what's happened recently. Von der Leyen last week announced that the EU would no more have business with Russia. Well, that was a bald-faced lie. That's not at all true. What she did is organize, and Trump did this as well. She and Trump made a deal. So now we're buying gas and other resources from the US, paying through the nose for this instead of the much cheaper gas, which we paid 5 times less before early 2022. And Modi is buying Russian gas, selling it to Funderland. That's what's happening. They're playing games. This is causing
Yeah.
a great stress as well, because we all know that the foundations of war are born with economic stress.
They absolutely are. I mean, if you look at the situation right now, it is pretty dire, I have to say. I don't feel that in the near future we're going to see much change. But look, uh, it doesn't have to be necessarily a bad thing that the situation is dire. The project of Europe uh, is not the same as the project of the European Union, and the European Union today is not what it was envisaged as when it was the common market. It's fair to say the European Union today is a neoliberal institution. The fact that in Greece, when they had the OHI referendum, essentially there was a coup, you could argue, and Europe ensured that Varoufakis was removed and that Tsipras would toe the line. It's pretty obvious that we're looking at a union that very much believes in the subservience of some of its members to the economies of others. So, the European Union is a neoliberal state. However, today the odds are Europeans see through a lot of the verbiage of the European Union and its pretensions. They don't take it as seriously as they used to even a decade back. That's a good thing. So look, if you look at NGOs, the reason NGOs do take over the limelight is partly because we let them. And it's because of the decline of existing political parties. It's a decline of voluntarism, the decline of politics in general. You're in Italy, in Ferrara. You'll, of course, remember that it was, what, 2 months back that there was a nationwide strike that was initiated by dock workers in Genoa. When I learned of the nationwide strike, I texted a friend of mine in Torino and I told him, I'm just so ashamed that we don't do this elsewhere. We don't do this in India. We don't do this in the United States where I live. Um, but on the other hand, it did happen in Italy. And that's saying something. And so I feel we're looking at all of these cracks widening. And as they widen, we will see the emphasis on NGOs as ways to paper over these cracks is not going to work anymore. We're going to see a variety of different civil society groups emerge. And here, if I may, I'll just very briefly turn to Gramsci. Gramsci argued that for the left to win, it would require it to do what the right does so well. And he was looking at fascism in the 30s, and he was looking at how the church, industry, so-called units of the family, law and order in quotes, all of them somehow were able to come up with a shared image of what Italy meant to them, a shared image of what everything meant to them, and somehow hold it together. Well, at the moment, the lunatics in the United Kingdom who claim to be conservative but are frankly just unhinged are trying to do something similar. And they're claiming that, they're going to make Britain the Great Britain again and do it by expelling undocumented migrants and so on and so forth. They're trying to create a shared image of what Britain means. The challenge of the left historically has been we're not very eager to create a shared image. We're very good at critiquing each other when we come up with solutions, but we're not all that good in trying to say, you know what, let's make this work. Not in terms of make it work efficaciously, but make it work as a language that we can hold together. And so that's what Gramsci really meant when he said we have to create a hegemony of the left. We don't have a hegemony of the left today, but we can. What they did in Genoa, those strike workers, right? I cannot argue that everyone who went on strike across Italy thought alike. Probably not. I can't even argue that they all felt exactly the same way about the Palestinian people. But I can argue that they all felt a sense of disgust, repugnance, and anger with the way things were. And that's enough. It's how you channel that and what you're willing to do. That's all. I mean, Subcomandante Marcos talks in one of his essays, it's a letter he exchanges with John Berger. It's a really wonderful letter. And he talks about the necessity of having pockets of resistance. He says that in the world we live in today, things don't fit neatly together. but diversity, even fragments, even contradictions are fine. And I think the challenge on the left is we'll really have to be more willing and more indulgent, if you will, of these fragments.
Well, also the way that class has shifted so radically, especially with the rise of digitalization and the reality that I remember in the 90s, in the late 90s, when my students at NYU were coming to me for letters of recommendation for internships, and I began to see the writing on the wall
Hmm.
then. And many went to graduate school because they didn't want to take a job at Starbucks. Things were beginning to collapse
Hmm.
already by the late 90s. And
Yeah.
the new working class has a master's, has even a PhD. And these are the realities that we're not seeing addressed by, let's say, social services and social
Hmm.
warehouses that protect the disenfranchised. Because the disenfranchised, we have this notion of the grapes of wrath in our head. But now the disenfranchised will be an NYU graduate with a six-figure debt to pay that he or she cannot possibly, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, here, Julian, you commented earlier about the crisis, not you, you commented earlier about the problems of higher education, reminds me that what we're looking at is a very close political linkage between the crisis of higher education, the crisis of established politics, and the potential of nascent potential of politics in the future. To put it in much simpler language, the fact that an NYU or a New School graduate cannot get jobs goes very closely with the crises within these institutions. And that crisis, in turn, goes closely with the possibility that some of these unemployed graduates will actually start to think that, things can't go on this way. Now, if that happens in the United States, it'll be monumental, truly monumental, because the problem with the United States is it really has, I mean, and here I'm actually quoting Julius Nyerere, it really has only one party with two wings, one wing being Democratic and wing being Republican. And this charade has continued now for 200 years. And, there are many Americans who genuinely believe in it, that they have two parties, but they are gradually becoming a minority. And so there is a good possibility that some of these people who can't get jobs, some of them who are disgusted with the politics of the Democratic Party right now, will actually force it to become a little more radicalized, or will just, ignore politics completely, establish politics completely, and create something else that doesn't fit into it and is quite subversive. I mean, we don't know. I work at the New School, and I wanted to make this clear to your listeners. The New School at the moment is in a crisis and is planning to lay off about 45%, I believe, of all of its faculty. And when I say lay off, the New School is being very, very fair. It actually is offering voluntary retirement to some of them. And if they are not willing to take voluntary retirement, it is also indicated that it'll be forced to start involuntary retirement in short termination in the next month. Now, I'm one of those who has received an offer of voluntary retirement, which I've not taken up. And so I'm painfully aware of this crisis of higher education. I'm also well aware that the New School is a poor institution. It certainly is going through a financial crisis. We can debate what's the best way to deal with it. I don't think that the best way to deal with it is what they're doing right now. But I would argue that there are a lot of students in our university in the past who have been inspired by it, who've been radicalized by being in it. And I think they see it the way I do, that this is all very closely connected. What they see in the education they received, what they see in the institution they once admired, and which is currently deeply, deeply in turmoil, are connected. They're connected to a world that's changing and where a new form of politics will emerge.
Has the new school lost 40% of its students, or what has driven the desire to cut 45% of the faculty?
Well, I mean, they have a huge deficit, and they also have a drop in enrollment because the United States government is not allowing foreign students to come in. And so, as a consequence, higher education across the United States, and in fact also in other places, is in a bit of a crisis. We're not able to get enough students. Now, at the same time, Part of this is not to do with students, and part of it is not to do with the deficit. There is a genuine belief among higher education leaders in the United States that the kinds of degrees they used to offer in the past don't work anymore. Some of them express this as the humanities doesn't bring in money, or that social sciences are staid and pointless. Some express it as there are new areas emerging that require creative combinations with the humanities and the social sciences. And some see this very much as an opportunity to go even further down the road of the MBA and of managerialism of different kinds. So it depends on who you're talking to and what they're looking at. But one of the challenges here is that higher education, the leaders of higher education in the United States, are not willing in any way to actually mobilize this for a political reckoning of any kind. They're eager to mobilize this actually for a sort of instrumental, frankly, managerial reckoning, where they can cut down programs, find revenue streams, create a lean and mean university. And in that sense, the new school is hardly unique.
I was thinking while you were talking about this because I've spent quite a bit of time since the early noughts in India. I was offered many jobs there by new universities like Flame. Do you know Flame? Or older institutions like Micah in Ahmedabad. And I was very interested by these institutions, all private, that have a curriculum that looks like this: law, dentistry, management, chemistry. Like it'll be like nothing resembling what you would find in any kind of liberal arts institution in the States. But I did notice this tendency
Mhm.
to move away from the humanities, which worries me
Yeah.
because I think we most definitely need the humanities. But the humanities brought it upon themselves as well, lest I remind our listeners about the pronoun badges that the NYU and New School graduates with six-figure debts can now say, well, at least I have a pronoun badge because they've learned a bunch of nonsense. This is a problem with the rise of identity politics. Identity politics needs to be discounted by the left, and it hasn't been. They've been fighting tooth and nail over this, I know, because I get death threats from some of these people. The work I did on the gender medicine scam in the UK, and that many other journalists and thinkers have written about, has ended very badly for that side of the equation, including Judith Butler. You know, a future essay I want to write is called Has Judith Butler Read Judith Butler? Because it's amazing how one can grift out a career over something that they didn't even do, but their followers, again, in the age of 700 words is too much for our readers. How is anyone going to read Judith Butler? But no, Judith told me that I'm a man. It's like, that's not what gender trouble is about, you know? And we have a whole revolution of industrial scale in many parts of the US, all over the US and Canada and Australia, now still fighting legal battles where women are basically saying, we don't want
Mhm.
men in our hospital wards, we don't want men in our prisons. It's a she, you know, like, oh my God. So this is what's happened. The Enlightenment has died. And I'm so glad you find this funny because this has been insane to witness. And as I mentioned earlier before we recorded, I was asked to teach at the New School a course on that in part dealt with gender ideology. But I never approached it as Judith
Mhm.
Butler says we all have an interior, like an inner child gender. No, that's bollocks. That was never part of what her work was about. And somehow capitalism was allowed
Yep,
to
indeed.
glom onto that and say, no, well, I'm really, my gender is this. I'm non-binary. Everyone's non-binary. You know, go and look at Menendoctes, right? That's non-binary. Gandhi was non-binary, right? You know, I mean, oh my God, the stupidity that has come from identity politics as the world crumbles.
Well, I mean, Asad Haider unfortunately passed away, I think a couple of weeks back. I've always felt that his view of this topic is a very credible and important view. And I feel that Asad Haider would argue that the notion of identity being somehow apart from everything else is a distraction, and that politics is expressed straight always through a combination of different forms of identity, whether it's racial or class, that they can't be separated. And, I would argue that, the notion of gender and what gender one feels one has is an important one. I personally have no problem with agonizing over pronouns. On the other hand, I do feel it's really troubling when that's all we do. And that's, of course, really what you're pointing out. Sure, I mean, we can discuss whether I'm a man or a woman, but if that's all we're going to discuss, then that isn't enough because we do live in a world where, in some parts of the world, femicide is common. We live in a world where women's labor is devalued everywhere and historically. So, gender is not simply a choice. Gender is also very much a form of politics and it overlaps on other forms of politics all the time. So, and I think that's what's really very important.
I would say that the gender identitarians have made gender this kind of station of the cross that one must pass. And
Yes, indeed,
my
they have.
problem with it all is when they say things like everyone has a gender. Well, no, I actually don't have a gender. Just like, okay, yes, I guess if you want to apply that to me, just like I'm a Scorpio, but I don't run around saying I'm Julian Vigo, I'm a Scorpio, also a fire horse. Again, late stage capitalism is having a go at us. I think we can do a bit better than to model our identities over pretenses of loss. And I do think a lot of this identity politics over gender is it's been displaced because again gender ideology rose in the aftermath of AIDS. This was when gay men were no longer
Hmm.
dying because Crixivan came on the market, protease inhibitors. People were able to live long lives and treat it as
Hmm.
if it were diabetes. What happened then is, again, going back to NGOs. Nidhi, this is about how do we stay open? Oh my
Hmm.
God, we're a rainbow organization and we've got the L and the G rights. Now the AIDS thing is sort of sorted out. Let's add a new letter. And this is what's gone on. I'm part of that alleged community, but no, T has nothing to do with my sexuality. The fact that someone feels like they want to identify with a stereotype, because, excuse me, but our forebears fought very hard, both men and women, so that I didn't have to be a Hausfrau. I don't have to like Laura Ashley because I'm female. Men do not have to naturally like lifting weights. Men do not naturally have to enjoy playing cricket or football. Why should they? I just think that the gender identity movement has really made a mess out of our political consciousness, frankly, because it's put the emphasis on what is personality and it's politicized personality. And they would say no, but I would say absolutely, because show me someone who identifies as a woman who's actually a man, it's not about vestiture. Because it's always coming down to vestiture. It's always
Hmm.
coming down to that. And if that's the thing, well, hello, 1970s. David Bowie then was non binary, so was Freddie Mercury, so were almost every single
Yes, indeed.
singer from the 1970s and 80s. I just had a go at YouTube the other day. I went down a YouTube hole looking at a lot of 80s videos. There's not one male group in those videos without more makeup than I've ever worn in my life. So I think that gender has become a really troubling sidecar that I wish the left would acknowledge it made a mistake on, or the pseudo left, because what do you do when you've got publications during lockdown, like Jacobin pushing lockdown, or earlier when I ran a piece on the gender issue in the UK, it ran a hit piece on me. I approached Bhaskar Sunkara and I asked to write a repost because it was actually defamatory. I have a problem where we've made an entire political spectrum about feelings and how you see me. Isn't this the exact opposite of what leftists should be doing?
I think so. I mean, I think that this is a conversation that requires another interview because I'd love to know more about the piece that Bhaskar Sunkara decided, could not could not remain as it is because I guess Jacobin is being sued. I'd love to read the piece too.
At the end of your book, you have this really wonderful graph where it's called Tracking Elements of Common Sense Across Development Doctrines. I really love it. That's, to me, I'm going to put it on my wall, I think, where you've got the doctrine, administration crisis, common sense, and conceptions, and then across the top, colonialism, state capitalism, then financialization in many aspects. I find it very interesting where you see, for instance, colonial resource development, the start of modernization, the modernization apogee, and then the end of modernization, dependencia, the Washington Consensus, and PWC, for instance. I like the way you sort of put things together. Could you talk to our listeners maybe about what you hope to see from the kind of chart that this represents, where you see racial superiority, the value of science and technology, world trade, modernized values that ensure democracy and market freedoms, etc., all the way through market growth for social allocation and development that requires capable states? Where do you see this chart bringing us as a humanity?
The purpose of that graph is to sensitize the reader to how common sense works and how common sense allows us to imagine NGOs function in a certain way and that NGOs are sufficient. So during modernization theory, NGOs were seen as proponents of technology, and therefore NGOs would create a technological utopia, if you will. In dependencia, NGOs were seen as being focused on the autonomy of local countries and would work very closely with the state to ensure that. And of course, today, after the Washington Consensus, NGOs are seen as somehow creating an innovative, social innovative landscape, working very closely with communities so that they can become financially self-sufficient and so forth. What I want to remind the reader is that each one of these is an ideological statement. They're a hegemonic view. They're not necessarily true. They have to be tested. But one aspect we know for a fact, whether they're true or not, they will allow us to keep looking at NGOs as somehow the solution. And I want to remind the reader that no, the only solution available is not through the NGOs, it's through us creating another kind of politics.